about how much the COVID virus has cost the world. I saw one estimation of $113 billion already. The city of Houston is reeling. Talked to a church leader there. The oil prices that we may be saying yay about, they're saying, oh my goodness, there went our church budget. Other churches are trying to wrestle through what to expect. And so we thought we'd close out having talked about caring for your church pastorally, caring for your church in a strategic way, but also now caring financially. And I'm thrilled to introduce the gentleman who's going to talk about that. Dusty Rubeck serves with what was formerly known as the Church Development Fund, or CDF, now called CDF Capital. And this is one of those brilliant paperclip ideas that when I heard about it, I thought, why didn't we think of this sooner? It started many years ago by offering a good interest rate to Christians to start it's kind of a savings and loan. So my family, as well as many others that I know, and churches have put their money there as well. Rather than having it in an account that earns this, okay, we put it in this account and it earns this, a little more, but the monies are used to loan to other churches and Christian works to help them. That's what Church Development Fund started as. It has continued, and I want to say props to them. CDF has offered if your church is having a financially difficult time, we'll reduce your payment, and I want to say it's by 1/3 over the next 6 months to give you some breathing room. So I love the grace that they're showing. But Dusty Rubeck, who has stepped in within the last year or two as the president of the organization, has been looking at, discussing with business leaders, how should churches prepare financially for what's next? And so, Dusty, thank you. Let me give it to you and say, what should we be doing? I think the question I wrote down here, your topic, financing in the time of COVID and beyond, you said you've got key questions. So what do you see as the key questions, Dusty?
Well, first of all, Jeff, thanks for inviting me to this great event, very helpful for church leaders. And I was just reflecting, my wife and I were talking actually this morning. You and I met in a lockdown, 1988. Denver, Colorado, we were in a blizzard at a CIY ski conference.
Wow.
And we were all snowed into this hotel, couldn't even get to the ski area one of those days. But anyhow, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you, and I'll try to be quick in going through some things about specifically financial leadership and other areas of leadership during this time. As I think about that blizzard, it compelled me to think back. I grew up on a farm and feedlot in northeastern Nebraska, and I remember getting ready for blizzards. The weather forecaster would say it was coming, and we would hunker down and get the animals protected as much as we could. And you'd have a few days of really bad weather, and you'd get dug out, and you would go back to things. But I read a great leadership article a couple of days ago, where a leader was suggesting we shouldn't look at this as a blizzard. This is much more the beginning of winter. And so the first point I would have for church leaders, whether it's financial leadership or any part of leadership, you really need to be prepared for the long haul. This thing came upon us very, very quickly. The first case was diagnosed, I think they're saying now, January 20th. Within 100 days, we had 1 million cases in the United States. Our economy went from roaring to snoring in a matter of days. Unemployment went from one of the lowest in history to now, as of today, 30 million claims for unemployment in insurance. GDP was down about 5%. Anytime that you have GDP go down and unemployment go up, that's when charitable giving begins to get hurt. Last year, about $125 billion was given to religious organizations in the US, but that's very tied to the GDP and what actually gets into people's pockets and whether or not they have jobs. So what we learned when we look back, and CDF's been doing this for about 67 years, if you look at September 11th, what happened, if you look at the 2008-2010 crisis, typically the faithful church giver, the very last thing they cut out of their budget is gifts to churches. So you might be seeing really strong giving right now or just slightly down. And as the economy comes up, there's an assumption everything's going to get better with donations. We would encourage you to prepare for the long haul. It's likely to last a bit longer, and it will probably hit worse later in the year. So just be cautious, Be optimistic, but also be realistic. Point number 2, I'll just list a couple of practical things that I think you should invest in. First of
Please.
all, invest in toilet paper. I think, Jeff, I really think this is a valuable leadership lesson. I mean, we tend to think that our people are rational. People are not rational. They're emotional, and they use their logic to back up emotional decisions. Think about this. We're fighting a virus that invades through your nose, through your mouth. It gets into your lungs. It invades the respiratory system. So what do Americans do? They go out in hordes and risk life and limb to create huge stocks of toilet paper. Now, I did not get an A in anatomy class, but unless something significant has changed, I think they're purchasing the wrong thing, right?
Tell me you don't have any slides on this, okay?
No
Don't
slides.
put them up, Julia, if he does.
I'm not naive, all right? I'm not naive, so no slides on that. But the Burpee Seed Company will tell you that they have a back order of vegetable seeds. The companies that hatch chickens. People are buying chickens and they're planting gardens. Those things make sense to hoard right now. Toilet paper, I just don't get it. If Dr. Horton was still here, I would ask, do you really think we ought to normalize that? That might be one thing that doesn't make sense. But my leadership lesson is this. For you, the point is, people are not afraid of the right things. And because of that, they rely on the wrong things. What is your church's toilet paper? What is the irrational thing that your church or your people or your leadership hang on to when evidence suggests it's the wrong thing? And I'm going to give you what my answer is, Jeff. It's money. It's possessions. It might be the building. Materialism is the most prevalent form of philosophy in the US today, far more prevalent than Christianity. It's the dominant lifestyle. The worship of the almighty dollar far outstrips the worship of the almighty God in this country.
It is for many the religion of today, right?
It is the religion. It's the #1 spiritual disease we have, and nobody knows they have it. They think they're normal. It's the silent spiritual killer. We need to wake up and address it. I think you can look at toilet paper and learn something about that. Point 3, invest in connections and community. You know, the stuff that Doug Parks shared, so powerful. And those guys, a lot of our churches work together on the same things. I can't say enough good things about intentional churches. If you've not engaged with them, you should be doing so. But invest in connections and community. Right now, that means investing in digital. It's not going to go away. The hybrid of face-to-face communications along with digital communications is a powerful thing. I'll tell you from a personal story, in the midst of this shutdown, my wife became very, very ill 3 weeks ago, had a high fever, a little bit of difficulty breathing, not much, but just this fever that wouldn't go away. We finally ended up at an emergency room here in Dallas. Late one evening, they said, yes, you've got COVID-19, but you're still breathing, so go home. We don't want to see you until you can't breathe anymore. You can't be here. Wow. So we go home and we face that. And a couple nights later, the fever got worse. We ended up at the emergency room again. And I've got to tell you, they meet us outside and they say, Mrs. Rubeck, you come with us. Mr. Rubeck, you don't walk through the door. And they grab her and pull her in. And the last thing I see is her face with a mask looking over her shoulder at me. That's the entire goodbye that we got to have. And we go into that, it was late on a Friday night. We go into that weekend. I tell you, it was the loneliest moment of my entire life. She gets in there, finds out that it's gallbladder, and there's an internal infection from that. And on Easter Sunday, she is delivered from a diseased gallbladder, and she gets to come home. But I'm telling you, in the midst of that, being alone, the texts that I got, the phone calls that I got, the FaceTime that I was able to have with my wife, that was the lifeline. When we add that to personal relationships, it's powerful. Invest in it, invest in it, invest in it. Next point I'd say is invest in planning and preparedness. You know, putting together various scenarios of what your church is going to be up against financially in the future needs to be a normal part of the process. As you mentioned, we offered to all of our loan churches 6 months of reduced payments, deferred payments, and all they had to do for the application was create a financial contingency plan. And they need to tell us, this is how the virus and the shutdown has hit us. Here's what we think might happen in the future. And if this happens, here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to do. That was the entire process. We've reviewed over 120 of those church contingency plans already. And I'll tell you, some of them are fantastic. Some of them, the churches didn't know where to start. And really, when you think about it, this is leadership 101, right? Being able to plan if a pandemic happens, earthquake, have we ever heard of one of those? Hurricane, have we ever heard of one of those? Tornadoes, not in Texas. I mean, this isn't the only thing that's going to happen to us. We need to do better planning of looking forward to the future and saying, if these things go wrong, here's what we would do. Because again, you don't know that attendance is going to jump right back. You know, Bob and Martha might say, we've really enjoyed drinking coffee in bed whilst hopping around to different churches, watching them on, you don't know what's going to come back. I think building bigger barns, which we call churches, that's probably going to be disrupted. We're going to have a lot of missionaries and a lot of developing parts of the world who have tremendous needs that we need to be plugging into. I think a rigorous review of how did we do? Did we enter this with enough reserves to go through this? How would we prepare differently for the next time? Next point, you're going to have to invest in safety and security. So I don't know if the government's going to mandate it or if it's just your people coming back are going to mandate it, but you're going to have to look at, there are going to be people who want distancing in church. That cuts down in your capacity. You're going to have to look at your ventilation systems, HVAC. Do we have to change something there? Do we need sneeze guards at the information desk? Do we need a different children's area? Is there going to be a baby boom 9 months from now? Are we going to have 10 million coronial babies in our building? I don't know, but people are going to expect that we've taken steps. Some of the populations that are most at risk for this, they're going to expect different things. That's not fun money to spend. I haven't talked to anybody yet who's exactly figured out the communion service. You talked about baptism, and I'm just, you know, the whole baptizing in Clorox, I just need to make clear, that is not okay, right? That's not okay. But you think about the passing of the communion elements and how people are going to experience that. There's a lot of things to think through. A couple more, I'm going to skip to the end because I know we're getting short on time. Here would be my primary thing. Finances, Jeff, are not the issue. Capital is the issue. And I'd like to challenge leaders to make sure you've got the correct framework for leadership and decision-making in the days, weeks, months, and years ahead. I say finance isn't the issue, it's capital. Capital is much broader than finance, right? Our model is this. We believe it takes 3 types of capital for a church to be healthy and growing. Yes, it takes financial capital. CDF has done a lot of work in that over 67 years. I think we've funded over 1,000 projects, $2 billion worth. We know a lot about that, but we also know there are churches with plenty of money who aren't healthy and who aren't growing. It also takes leadership capital. It also takes spiritual capital. When God brings the right blend of those 3 things together, when that's in balance, we see transformation happens in people's lives. So from a financial capital perspective, I would simply say, plan differently for the future. If you had known this was going to happen 12 months ago, would you have made any different financial decisions at that time to prepare for this? Well, we know something will happen again. Let's be ready. Did we have enough money to serve those who suffered the most? Did we have enough money to continue to support our missions? I think it's very unfortunate that for many, they see government as saving them. And the payroll protection plan, for a period of time, I heard a lot more about that than I did about prayer programs for churches. And I don't think we should be proud of that. I think it's a shame that many of us were in that spot. Leadership capital, the same thing. I would say, think differently. There's a lot of talk about getting back to normal. Well, normal was February 2020. Do we really want to go back to that? I mean, was February 2020 really that awesome in Christianity in America that that's what we want to restore? I don't think so. let's think differently. Let's not go back to business as normal. Let's not go back to that as the usual thing. I think leaders need to ask the question, are you absolutely certain that you've been asking the right questions? I think if you do things with intentional churches and organizations like that, you're really going to get challenged on your questions. And finally, spiritual capital. Perhaps from a capital perspective, a numbers perspective, I would challenge you to do this. Start counting differently. Count different things. If all we count is seats and donations, attendance and donations, how are we different than a football stadium or a football event? Participation might lead to transformation, but it does not equal transformation, and it doesn't necessarily even measure it well. So I think from a spiritual capital perspective, we need to think differently about how we want to measure things. Listen, this whole social distancing, I don't even remember hearing of it until this year. And now it's everywhere, and it's very painful for many. Here's the only remedy that I know of, for social distancing, and that would be spiritual intimacy. Imagine if we could lead our people during this time, and several of your speakers have already mentioned this, if we could lead our people to use a time of social distancing to become more intimate with God than any time in their life, we would come back and God would use us to change the world. But if all we want is to be back in the comfort of our pews with our friends and neighbors, we will have lost a huge opportunity. If you and I don't think about these things, who's going to? That would be my challenge.
Wow. Okay, I'm trying to wrap my head around all that. Let me start with this question. You started by saying, Dusty, that we should expect that finances at church are going to be challenging over the coming months. I've already talked to church leaders who are trying to figure out, and boy, nonprofits. I was on a meeting this morning with a great nonprofit organization where I'm a trustee, and it is tough times.
Yep.
So let me ask you a hard question. When it comes to cutting back, when it comes to trying to tightening the belt, salary cuts, layoffs, do you have any thoughts about hard choices like that?
Well, I've got lots of thought about them, but all leadership is situational, right? So the situation you and I were leading in a year ago is very different from what we're leading in right now. So in any given organization, that becomes one of the toughest decisions. Do we all rally around? And I think you probably see this in most churches. Do we all rally around and we're all going to sacrifice equally? Or are we going to let some people go? And I think it really comes down to how long is this long haul? So if it's a relatively short period of time, if it's 3 months, 4 months or less, I think most leaders would probably lend towards, let's keep the band together and we'll all take some pay cuts and stay there. If it's longer than that, sooner or later, that's the biggest expense on the church budget. Sooner or later, it's going to happen. And I'll tell you, practical experience would suggest at times like these, God uses times like these to move team members to different teams. I think sometimes we get this idea that if we've hired an employee, we've adopted an employee. It is not our responsibility to provide welfare for them the rest of their. I'm not saying be cold-hearted about it, but I'm saying there are a lot of churches that have accumulated a huge amount of ministry talent, and in the season ahead, some of that talent needs to go elsewhere and lead because they're not going to reach their highest potential at that place.
Well, one of the challenges within our church world is that we use family language, right?
Yeah.
We're all family. We're a family. Our team is a family. And when you start using that language with your staff, you can't fire Uncle Bob.
Yeah.
You have to kill him. So, I mean, that's a tough spot to be in, which should maybe help us to think about strategically. It's not that I want to take money from this, but we've got to have money for this.
Yep.
So what is the this that's important? I'm going to say this out loud. You mentioned mission work. For many churches, one of the first, sadly, easiest places to snip is Well, we're just not going to send any more money to that missionary over there for now because we can't afford it. I'm throwing you a softball. You want to say a word about that?
Yeah, I do, because and I've been on both sides of that. I've been on church staff through the years, and I've led parachurch organizations for years. So I've been on both sides of that. I think I would cut to the heart of it. Where is God's heart really weeping about what's going on? It's in the vulnerable communities here in the U.S. But when this hits the rest of the developing world, who does not have the financial resources, the medical resources, I think in those countries, we're not going to say, oh, this was all hyped out. I think we're going to see tragedy. And I think the opportunity and the need for Christians in America to invest in those dark places in the world that don't have all of the things we have, I think this is a time to greatly ramp up what we're investing there and quit focusing on building bigger barns. Hey, that's a big part of the world I live. We make loans to people who build big buildings, and it's just not really our heart. Our heart is about the three types of capital. Our heart is about kingdom growth, about impact in the kingdom, and we have gotten terribly, terribly. I mean, you think about how many times have all of us in our tribe talked about the church is not that building, and yet when that building is taken away from us, wow, the cry across the country has been huge. There's an old chess school that talks about if you want to be a great chess player, you start without a queen on the board. And if you can learn to win without a queen, you're going to be a great chess player. Well, for many churches, I'm just going to say, they're building the facade, the impression, that's become their queen. And it's been taken away from them. And some of them, creative, courageous leaders, we're seeing great things happen. Some haven't woken up to that new reality yet, but for all of us, this is a chance for us to practice what we preach. That building is not the church. We, the people who are the children of God, we are the church. So
Amen.
Yeah, I think this is a chance for us to completely reprioritize what we do with money instead of just worrying about how do we raise more of it in the future.
Well, I'm going to ask one more question because a lot of what we've talked about may make folks feel like we're not a multi-site church. We don't have a giant building. What would you say for financial preparedness or even messages that need to be taken to leadership teams in churches that are 70, 90, 100, 200? Thoughts about that size congregation?
Thoughts about that size congregation for what? What was the question? I couldn't quite.
Folks who are between 50 or 200 and trying to sort out what should we be prepared for next. We're not a multi-site church. We're not a multi-staff church.
Well, I think, we've done surveying of thousands of churches across the country and dove deep into 100 some in their financial plans. It's really not a size issue, probably. So we see the churches that are going to struggle are churches that have debt, particularly too much debt. Churches that did not have reserves. And there are small churches with lots of reserves, large churches with lots of reserves, and the other. So I don't think it changes much. In fact, Jeff, I think sometimes for the smaller church, that building can become a fortress for them. And we see oftentimes small churches that really need to make a decision to do something different, to grow or to reach into their community, but the protection of that small building has become even more important to them, perhaps at a big church. So I don't think it's a size issue. I think it's a heart issue. Might I say, it's an idolatry issue. It's what is the place of that building in our theology and in how we actually live. And I think if every one of us were to be made the offer, someone's going to come along and offer you a record price for your building tomorrow and release all of this money into kingdom work, what's your answer to that question going to be? I think that mental exercise would help churches know, what does this building really hold? What place does it really hold in who we are? Texas, every county is known for a great courthouse. And there's this old quote by an architect that said, a courthouse is a community's image of itself set in stone. Well, I think that's a beautiful quote for courthouses. Unfortunately, I'm afraid it's true for churches at times too.
Wow.
I would rather never make I can honestly say this as the CEO of CDF Capital, I would rather never make another loan in the future for a church building if we could help churches do what Doug Parks and his team are talking about, double, triple, quadruple their impact, and forget that the building was a part of it. That would be a life well invested.
Wow. You can reach out to Dusty, and we're going to put his contact information, or you can put your preferred email. Oh, great. It's already online there.
Already online.
To reach out to CDF for more financial advice. Thank you, brother, for taking time to be with us.